listening to Resist and Restore, a podcast from the Circle of Hope Pastors, where we are extending the table of our dialogue. I'm Jonny Rashid. I use he, him pronouns.
And I'm Julie Hoke. I use she, her pronouns.
And Rachel Sensenig, who is usually with us, is on vacation, which we are learning is good to do. So she is away, and we wish her rest and peace and love, and we miss her, and we wish she was here, but we're glad she's getting rest. Are you getting some rest this summer, Julie?
Yeah, I just got back from vacation, too.
Oh, good. I went to the Poconos already. I got a vacation planned again to the Poconos. It's the only place I go, apparently. I'm going to D.C., Washington, D.C., on my own.
Nice.
To see my homies, you know.
It's good.
I'm going to the nation's capital, but I'm going to bring the energy of the nation's birthplace. That's us. That's Philadelphia. Greatest city in the world.
But it's good to leave the city sometimes, too.
Yeah, I don't like leaving the city to go to the country particularly. Like Marcel was talking about camping yesterday. Do you like camping?
I don't camp.
Do you glamp?
No.
That's like glamorous camping?
I know.
So like the tent has sequins on it or something?
I don't have a tent at all. So I don't even have the equipment for camping. But I love building fires. I love cooking over the fire. I'll do that in my backyard.
Do you bring like a cast iron out there?
I could, but I don't. I just use like a grate. Anyway.
That's nice. I like this.
It does feel like, it feels like vacation to like cook and eat outside. I love that.
See, I like that. Cooking and eating outside, and then you go back in your bed. And then you don't have to wake up in the middle of the night and leave the tent, and it's dewy, and then you have to pee, and your bear could be there eating you. Like, all sorts of things could happen to you. I don't. Camping is not for me. But if I ever go camping with you, I want you to know it's because I love you.
It's an act of love.
I hate camping, but I love you.
I think I would like camping. My family's not particularly into it, and we don't have the equipment for it, but I would do it.
When I was reading on our daily prayer last week, you can go back to our daily prayer, circleofhope.net/dailyprayerdeeper. The author was writing about something that wasn't camping. It was called backpacking. And you can't bring a cast iron backpacking. You gotta, you gotta like, it's lightweight stuff, because you're going far. It's like,
you carry everything with you.
It sounds horrifying. But the way he wrote about it was helpful.
It was so beautiful. That whole week of entries was really good. So even if you're not a backpacker or a camper.
Such as me.
I recommend praying through that week of entries. It's really good.
So I'm so glad we're doing the show, though. It's so fun to be together, Julie. Later on in our show, we're going to hear from Kristy Burmeister, who is my friend that I've known. I've only actually met her through the internet. I'll tell you more of the story when we connect, when Kristy and I talk. But she has a poetry book called Apologies out, and then she also has one that came out a few years ago that I'm going to focus on. It's called Act Normal, and it's her memoir. We're going to talk about her story, and she has a lot of wisdom to offer us, and I'm grateful to have her on the show, especially following this episode that we did with Angela Lamb of Hagar's Voice, formerly Jesus Collective. And let's start doing some talkback now about Angela. How does that sound to you, Julie?
Yeah, great. Didn't we get some response to that episode with her?
Yeah, one person said, and I love this. Of course, I love Angela.
So do I.
This person said, Angela Lamb is so great, and I agree. So many good quotes, so much wisdom, and she talks in a way that's so powerful. And she said, I think our church leadership could learn a lot from what she talked about, or rather there are things that she mentions that we still have a lot of learning to do about that. And I'm very interested in that. I like the idea of our guests helping us become the kind of church that we want to be. Mm-hmm. So in knowing Ange, Julie, what would you say are things that we might learn from her?
Well, let me just start by saying, if you haven't heard this episode yet, I highly recommend it. Angela is doing work through Hagar's Voice, which is a a platform to lift up the voices of victims of clergy sexual abuse. And she is a victim advocate and a prophetic voice. And
what's a victim advocate mean?
She works to come alongside and uplift the voices of those who have experienced oppression, abuse, in order to journey with them in a healing process. And often that involves being able to tell the truth, tell their truth, be heard, be seen, be validated, be treated with dignity when there's so many, so many forces at work that might deny their story, minimize it, sideline, their experience, because it's so difficult and so painful for the church specifically to face the abuse of power that happens and can happen within the church, just like outside of the church. We're not immune to that. So she's especially gifted at walking with victims and listening and uplifting their voices, and then also teaching and supporting victims to share from their own experience, to teach the church how to change the dynamics, how to respond when abuse of power and, when abuse has happened. I don't know. Is that a good enough summary for those who haven't heard it yet?
Totally. So let's unpack it. What do you think? What do you think the big takeaways are? What can we learn from this? I have some ideas myself.
Ange offers very practical steps to move the needle for safety for women and I would say for everyone really in the church. I think, Jonny, didn't the person writing to you name some specific ones? It was like Circle of Hope should do this.
Yeah, let's look at it right now. Being trauma informed. You've talked about this a lot, Julie, about us being trauma informed in leadership and even getting a training on it. And then making clear statements that affirm not in our house. Making it clear that there are people you can talk to if you experience abuse. Having a policy that helps guide us. Those are some of the things. What do you think, Julie?
Well, another thing that I have learned through Angela and her work is that the tendency to look at situations of abuse as like a moral failing and an individual act is often it's just inadequate, because in a church environment, in a systems environment where abuse is happening, it's because the whole environment, there's a culture that allows for that to happen, and we all participate in some way, whether we know it or not. So part of what she is offering through her wisdom and experience and expertise is to say, no, there's something that everyone in the church can do. This is a communal responsibility to develop a culture that won't allow for the abuse of power to happen.
That's beautiful. It's the idea that we can have a culture that takes a lot of work.
Yeah.
I mean, changing... On one hand, I think that changing the culture is good and important, but it's slow. And when we're talking to survivors and victims of abuse and things like that, they definitely need more concrete steps than that, or some reassurance, and this is tricky because when we put, I'm going to say policy, but when we put policy into place or statements into place, they often fall short of fixing the problem, but they also piss everyone off. Does that make sense? if it's challenging the culture makers in the church, they'll be mad. And so you'll enter into a dispute about this, and a fight and conflict, and even it could get worse before it gets better. Like there could be more abuse as you try to stop it, as you try to change it. Yeah, sure.
That comes up.
We often, so like that's.
Well, I talked about this on our maybe our podcast episode 2 times ago, maybe that Angela is hosting a podcast called Hagar's Voice, where she's interviewing victims of abuse. And the premise of that sounds, to me, it's like, that sounds terrible. Like, why would you have a whole podcast interviewing people who have been victims of clergy sexual abuse or clergy abuse?
Totally.
But it's so skillfully done and so much in the spirit of repentance and restoration,
right.
Redemption, because
right.
the victims are offering, from their own experience, they're offering wisdom and guidance for how to do it. So like, Jonny, what you just said, no, a policy is not going to change a culture. A written HR manual is not, or a statement or something on our website doesn't guarantee any kind of safety in our
You can still have an abusive culture even if you have these guardrails, right?
Absolutely.
But that doesn't mean we shouldn't have them.
No, these are practical steps that we could take, but then also listening to victims of abuse, they have a wealth of wisdom to offer about how to create this kind of culture, how to see things from a systemic level, not just a personal one-on-one interactions or something. So, yes, it is slow work to change a culture. Yes, we do need to have explicit statements and policies and structure, like clear structure for how someone might report a concern or just kind of see the transparency in our community. But then also, we each have to have a sense of ourselves as responsible for creating the culture together, because a statement won't do that.
Totally. So, statements in policy can help us create safety, but we're going for a longer-term transformative process, and that takes time. And with that in mind, you're saying listen to victims? Seriously, y'all. Listen to the interview with Angela, but also listen to the one with Kristy here. We're trying to elevate these voices and listen to them so that we can change, so that we can grow. And we've really decided as a church that that's the best way forward. So whether it's victims of clergy sexual abuse, victims of racism, victims of ableism, of homophobia, listen to them, and we won't repeat our mistakes. Well, we could, but we're learning together, you know? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thanks, Julie. I'm so glad you're listening to our podcast. It's cool to be connected. I love extending our table to you, and I want you to be a part of it. Please write back to us, Resist and Restore Podcast at circleofhope.net, and we'll definitely have you on the show and your words if you'd like. And help this podcast get around. You can do that by sharing it with people that you think would like listening to it. We're looking for people who are looking for us. If you don't think it'd be someone's bag, don't waste your time trying to convince them. Look for people who are looking for us. And then also subscribe to the podcast and then give it a high rating. Those things help other people find us too that are looking for this sort of thing as well. And then go to our website, go to circleofhope.church to find out how you can get connected, how you can share money with us, and how you can just, know what's happening, be a part of our body. So glad you're here. We love you a lot. Hey y'all, I'm so pumped to have my friend Kristy Burmeister here on our podcast. Kristy and I gotta tell this story because it's a little unusual. Kristy and I, first of all, we've never met in person, and we know each other through a series of Facebook groups that spawned off of a subreddit. So Reddit is a website and it has subreddits, and this was the Christianity subreddit, and then we made a group, a community based around that group. And Kristy and I have been in and out of that space and those spaces for a while. And, we developed a connection, and we had a lot of common like-minded thoughts and similar experiences, even in a group like that, just as minorities. And so it's been fun and good to be connected to her. And I'm so excited to share her story with you. Kristy, welcome to our show.
Hi, thanks.
So you wrote this powerful book. It's called Act Normal. I have it right here in my hands. And it came out in 2018.
Yes.
And it documents a personal story of yours of being stalked and abused in a church. And it was, your family's church, right? Is this
right
about this?
Yes. Yeah, my dad was the pastor.
So this is extremely vulnerable to write. And
yes.
So just, I'm inspired by your courage. Why did you want to share your story like that in this form?
Sure. So we talk a lot about religious trauma now. But when I started writing the book, it wasn't as widespread of a topic as what it is right now. Even with Me Too really took off in late 2017. And I started writing Act Normal in 2015 because there weren't a lot of stories like mine out there in the public. I had heard other accounts from other people similar to mine, but I'd never read a book that showed any of that. And I also thought that it was really important to put a story out there that didn't have a happy ending where everything was all tied up at the end. There's no justice in the end of Act Normal. And that is the reality for most people who deal with things like this, is there is no justice.
That's really hard.
Yeah.
So there isn't, when we read these accounts, it should shake us, right? It should spark us into action to maybe changing some things about our society, about our church, paying attention to what victims and survivors are telling us to comfort the afflicted, but also hopefully prevent further harm and abuse from happening. So I think your book is a great contribution to that dialogue. I would love more people to read it. It's hard to get your name out there when you're working first-time author, small press,
yeah.
that type of thing. So I think it's important. I think your story really matters, and I'm grateful you wrote it. You really do beautifully document in the book what happened. I'm sorry I'm recommending it again, but how you tell your story from a fairly young age into your adulthood is powerful. It's moving. It's vivid. And it exposes so much about, and we'll get into this later, about the culture of Christianity, of Anabaptism, of purity culture, all these things that create a ripe environment for abuse to happen. When people ask you, what do you say when someone says, "Can you share your story?" You can't summarize the whole book right now, but what do you say when people want to hear? How can we understand where you're coming from and what happened to you? Are you willing to share that?
Sure. So the Cliff Notes version, for context, when I was about 10, my parents discovered Mennonites, and they fell in love with Anabaptism and converted. My dad ended up going to seminary and becoming a Mennonite pastor. So when I was a teenager, right after I'd graduated high school, at our church where my father was a pastor, there was a middle-aged man who started paying a lot of extra attention to me that was not appropriate.
And how old were you? Do you remember?
I was 18. Okay. Yeah.
Wow.
Barely 18. Yeah. And so that escalated into the stalking, which escalated into death threats and break-ins and all sorts of traumatic things.
That is so and really, really horrible things happened to you, right?
Yes.
Like Bible passages being used to threaten you,
yes.
And you finding personal belongings in different places.
Yeah.
And that is so scary. You carried the dread in your body.
Right.
Everywhere you went.
Well, and that's the important thing about stalking cases that make them a little different sometimes, because it's not so much about necessarily what he's done. It's more about what he could potentially do, what he's threatening to do. Totally. And you walk around all day not knowing if he's around a corner with a gun or if he's around this, in your closet, because he keeps breaking into your house. And you mentioned the Bible passages. That's probably the thing that makes me angriest about everything that happened. Was one of the times he broke in, he stole my first Bible that I had ever had and would underline threatening passages and leave them for us, for me and my family to find.
How did your family respond when they saw these things?
They were angry. They were scared. We tried to work with the police department, the county sheriff. We didn't get a lot of help there.
The cops did not help you?
No. They either didn't believe that anything was really going on, that we were just either making stuff up or we were just trying to cause problems.
Even though you had evidence?
Even though we had evidence. Yes. They thought, well, maybe we were doing that and leaving things.
That's so horrifying, right?
It is. And that is very, very typical in stalking cases, that they are not taken seriously by the police. We did have a family friend who is a police officer that did try to help and tried to push the other officers to help, but he did not get anywhere in that either.
Wow. Were there moments? So you were abused, and then people didn't believe you. The cops didn't believe you. Right. Your book is titled "A Memoir of a Stumbling Block."
Right.
People thought you were a problem for the church because of your story, because you shared it. And that's that. So you have the stalker abusing you, and then you have the church reinforcing that abuse by ignoring you and not listening.
Yes. And, even further than ignoring, I was cornered in the fellowship hall by one of the women that was on our church council that I had babysat her children for her through high school. She had been my youth leader my first year there. Cornered me in the fellowship hall and told me that he was not stalking me. And if he was, it was because of the way I was dressed, that I brought it on myself if it was happening.
18 years old.
18 years old.
That kind of gaslighting, because, correct me if I'm wrong, you're experiencing these things, but when people constantly question them, and maybe you didn't do this, but the survivors do this, you question yourself. Is this really happening? Am I making this up? Is this real? And that creates that exposes you further to more pain and more abuse. Sure. And it's good. You said, I wrote the story. I started writing this in 2015, and not a lot of people were saying it. And the more we say, the more we share, the more other people feel like they can too.
Absolutely.
So sharing your voice helps and encourages others to do the same. And you were brave in doing so. What made you break through the gaslighting? How does that's hard, Kristy.
It is. So I did not have the benefit of therapy after this. Not to go back over what's in the book, but
go ahead. You can do that.
Yeah. So my family, we had to flee the state basically to get away from this man. It was dangerous to the point that I was going to be murdered. So I dropped out of college, lost my full scholarship that I had. My family went and stayed in another state with a family friend of ours for quite a while because we didn't have any money. We didn't have our own home. And so I did not have any access to therapy immediately after this, or even in the years following. And so I did start to think over the years, maybe it hadn't really been as bad as what I thought it had been, and I needed to get over it and get on with my life. And it wasn't until I sat down and started working on the book and started just jotting down notes of things that I remembered had happened. I went through pictures. I interviewed people that knew me back then and asked them what they remembered. talked to my family. And when I laid it all out in these notes, I was horrified. I was in my 30s by then and looking back at what an 18-year-old went through, and I was just horrified by it. And that's how I really finally broke through all of that gaslighting, like you said.
That's great. So writing your story helped you do that.
Yes.
Helped you see it, telling your story, remembering it.
Right.
I've had experiences where you look, and this is hard too. You look back at your life and you think, oh, this didn't. Now that I know this now, I'm looking back and now I can see clearly in the past what happened to me, how I was abused, how I was mistreated.
Yes.
And even that takes courage. Writing a memoir, it's not scientific, right? You're telling a story. And so even that, you can get lost in that too. And I just want to encourage people that you could get into the trap of thinking you're fictionalizing your life.
Right.
But, believe your instincts, believe your experience, share your story. I want more people to do that because it's important that we keep telling these stories, A lot of people hear a story like this and they'll say something like, that's just how the world is. Mm-hmm. It's actually worse in the world than it is in the church. Stuff like that. Christians in particular will say this. I think that these issues, when it comes to ignoring victims of abuse, ignoring stalking, all these things, are not just of the world. I think that in Christian communities, especially in tight-knit ones, especially in churches without accountability, and the lack of accountability can happen in a mega church or in a tiny church. Mm-hmm. I think we create environments where this can happen, where abuse can happen. How much do you think that's a part of Christianity in general?
Yeah, I think that it is. I think, it is part of our greater culture. Sure. But there are special ways within Christianity that operates. Whenever we have certain, like say a small church, my experience was in a very small rural church where one family tends to kind of run the church and you can't question that family because they're so influential in it. That is very much a part of church culture in those smaller churches. When we talk about things like male headship, where, so when men are supposed to be in charge of everything, you automatically discount what women are going through. Totally.
So small knit churches with power families, and those power families can exist in bigger churches too.
Sure.
There are unwritten rules about who's in charge.
Right.
A newcomer comes and they know you're not supposed to say this to this person. You got to get oriented to the rules of the church. That kind of enmeshment can lead to abuse. And then further, men being in charge. I was listening to, I'm keeping track. I don't know if I recommend this widely, but I was keeping track of the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast. And I have many issues with it. And one of them is they had a pastor on who is from a denomination that believes in male headship, that doesn't affirm women in ministry. And he did have ideas about accountability, distributing power, and oversight that I thought were sound for avoiding abuse. But at the end of the day, everybody involved in those conversations are men. And so we just ignore a big problem. Even if you have decent polity, organizational structure, there are theological things that can still make abuse happen,
Right.
Those men can cover things up, can because they have a common interest because they're men, so diversity in those things is really important. I totally agree with you. Do you want to say more?
Well, I was just going to say, even you lose the perspective of anyone who isn't one of those people in a position of power when you're not including other people in there.
Complementarianism, which is the belief that both in the church and in our households, and some people would even say in other spheres of organizations where only men are the leaders, that men always speak, always teach, always are the buck stops with them all the time. complementarianism, and then also purity culture.
Mm-hmm.
These kind of things lend themselves to abuse, in my experience. Did you experience that too? How the church talks about sex and male domination in general, lending itself to an environment where both abuse happened, but also victims could be ignored?
Oh, sure. Complementarianism does give men a sense of entitlement to women, right? It just does. And I know plenty of men who believe in complementarianism, and they're very nice men. They like me, and everything. But there's no such thing as benign sexism.
Right.
There just isn't. And
it is sexist.
Contributing. It is sexist. And they're contributing to this, even though they would be horrified by anything that happened to me. So yeah, it does give them that sense of entitlement. My stalker had a sense of entitlement towards me. He felt like he was owed me. I wasn't a human person. I was a thing he was owed.
Absolutely. And when the woman corners you in the church saying this happened because of how you were dressed, she's giving him that entitlement.
She's giving him that entitlement. Right. Yeah. Exactly.
So, that's important to know, that when you burden the survivor when you blame the survivor for their own abuse, it's there are structural and theological issues that can lend itself to that,
Right.
Still today, people will look at the story in the Bible that ruined King David's life, right? When he raped Bathsheba. And they'll say she was the seductress. She did this to him, even though the biblical account makes no suggestion like that. We still do. And Jesus says, if your eye causes you to stumble, cut it out. He ain't telling women not to wear yoga pants or something like that. That's not even. So we have such a sexist interpretation of the Bible, even. And that can lead to abuse too. Can you talk more about how purity culture impacts this?
Sure. So in our church, I was a teenager when I Kissed Dating Goodbye came out.
Oh, yeah.
And I wasn't. Our church was heavily influenced by that. They were pushing, courtship and all of this stuff, that we shouldn't be dating. I was dating a boy from our church. And the fact that I wasn't going down this courtship path that most of the people in our church thought we ought to do as, young women who didn't want to be temptations, it justified in a way what my stalker was doing to me. That if I had only been more righteous and doing what I was supposed to be doing, none of this would have happened to me. That purity culture would have kept me safe is the lie.
Totally. And that's important to note, that that's another way that we burden people with their own abuse. And ultimately don't hold the men accountable who are being abusive, causing harm. I want to talk about, since Circle of Hope, the church that I help lead, is an Anabaptist church. And you come from an Anabaptist background, though you aren't currently. You wouldn't call yourself an Anabaptist now.
No, not anymore. No.
What does this kind of abuse happen more in Anabaptism? Or do we have specific things that lend itself to that, is really what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, I don't think it necessarily happens more within Anabaptist spaces, but maybe happens for different reasons sometimes within Anabaptist spaces, which is important to look at. So one of the reasons why I, enjoyed maybe not enjoyed your book, but appreciated your book.
Thank you, Kristy.
Was whenever you're talking about the third way thinking. And I knew exactly what you were talking about, because Anabaptists can get so obsessed with not choosing sides that by default, they're siding with the predator.
Yeah, if you can't choose between the abuser and the survivor,
yes,
then you're with the abuser.
You're with the abuser. And that happened to me, not only with the stalking, but that also happened to me immediately after the stalking at a well-known Mennonite college that has since been exposed for not handling sexual assault cases very well.
Is that Goshen? Am I right about that?
Yeah, that's Goshen.
Sorry, we can say it, right?
We can say it. I've gone off a couple times on Twitter about it, so I've named them. But yeah, so it's, we can very easily pretend that we are being loving of everyone and non-judgmental when we're not picking sides and saying, no, this was wrong. Okay, no, this is the innocent victim here. But we're not being holy. We're not being righteous. We're frankly being lazy because we don't want to get involved is really what it boils down to.
Totally.
And then when we're talking about Anabaptism too, I can't not talk about pacifism and how that can play into it. There are many communities that will view going to the police as committing a violent act against someone that you're reporting, that they don't want outsiders involved. We want to handle it within our own communities, which was what my church wanted to do.
What's the risk with that?
So the risk with that is within our own communities, we can't handle it. We're not objective. Predators don't just groom their victims, they groom their communities too.
Totally. Say it again. Yeah.
So predators don't just groom their victims, they also groom their communities. Yeah. And
go ahead. I want to respond, but go ahead.
So we simply can't be objective enough to look at some of these cases when it's the person being accused is maybe a family member or somebody you grew up with or somebody that you've ministered with for years alongside. We lose that objectivity. We have to bring in outsiders.
And Anabaptists really don't want to do that.
No.
And you can see it. I don't know a lot about this, but from what I hear in very, very tight-knit communities, Old Order Mennonite and Amish communities, abuse can happen and no one ever knows about it and people are being harmed. You got to break out of the community and tell your story. But we have tight-knit communities. When I hear church described as family, at this point in my life, that sounds scary.
Yes.
That doesn't sound good. We're a tight-knit community. We do everything ourselves. We resist the world, which Anabaptists love to do. Right. And that's frightening to me because we need outside accountability, not just from denominations, from other people too, And I also want to say that having accountability and having investigations that come from people that are familiar with how churches work is important as well.
Yes.
Because we have weird things or just unusual things that take some expertise to learn about. And so telling your story can be helpful for all of us. I've experienced how third way thinking has and kind of an abuse of forgiveness and grace has kind of led to more of it. As a victim of abuse myself, I've been told that what we need to do is reconcile, right, as if the harm is mutual. Now, sometimes reconciliation is appropriate between two people that have harmed one another, or there's a misunderstanding, but it's inappropriate when it's about abuse. So let me ask you this. Anabaptists also love a little passage in the book of Matthew, chapter 18, verses 15 through 20, where there's these steps to reconciliation that you're supposed to do. And the first step is this, Kristy. The one who was sinned against is supposed to confront the one who sinned against them. Has that ever been applied to you in this situation?
Oh, yeah, I've gotten plenty of judgment on that.
That you didn't use Matthew 18.
Right. Even though I was a literal child and he was 40 or something. Yeah, because
that is so scary. Oh, my God.
It is. And what people do not understand is that when you're dealing with abusive dynamics, that is incredibly dangerous. To put that on the victim to go confront their abuser. That cannot apply in situations of abuse. That can apply if, somebody got mad at me and called me a mean name or something. But we're on the level playing field, then I can go talk to them. And then if they're still being a jerk constantly to me, then we escalate it, as the steps are outlined. But no. And, that gets thrown at domestic violence victims all the time too. You are supposed to work with your abuser and deal with it that way.
I have heard abusive pastors use Matthew 18 to protect themselves.
Yes. Yeah.
So you talked about me to this group, or you brought it to this group, and now you're not following the Bible, and you're not Christian, and you're not following what Jesus said. That's spiritual malpractice and spiritual abuse.
So what a lot of times they'll do is they will call it gossip. And they'll say, well, gossip is a sin. And if you're saying things behind my back that you're not saying to my face, then you're gossiping. Sharing information is not gossip. But that's how they spin it to try to go, see, I'm the victim here.
Totally. And I think that, first of all, I wrote a paper about this that came out in Earth and Altar, but I think that Matthew 18 has a very specific application. And certainly Jesus or Matthew didn't mean for it to be used in the ways that we're using it. Mm-hmm. But Jesus also says, because I think this happens, you get abused in a Christian environment, you get abused in a church, and you lose faith. Mm-hmm. Like, for those who stay in churches and keep the faith despite their abuse, I'm not prepared to say that's the right thing to do, but good for you if you can do that and figure out how to hold on to it. But it takes a lot of courage to leave too. Mm-hmm. We should honor people that do, instead of telling them they're hellbound. Jesus says, if you cause one of these little ones to stumble, sometimes he means children, but sometimes he means those oppressed people, little ones, mm-hmm. lowly ones, then it's better for a millstone to be hung around your neck and you thrown into the Sea of Galilee than the judgment that awaits you. Jesus preserves. I think God saves survivors of abuse that have lost their faith, because it's an untenable thing to continue to even worship in an environment or in a faith tradition where you've been so harmed.
Yeah, well, and I think that that's a lot of it. So I have no background in mental health. I want to make that very clear.
Sure.
But in dealing with my own issues, what I've learned is, because I have PTSD from what happened to me, is that often you can have a traumatic event happen, but sometimes the deciding factor on whether you develop PTSD from that or not is the support that you have in the aftermath of what happened. Mm-hmm. And that's where churches are make it or break it. Because if the church believes that person and supports them appropriately, that can be the difference between maintaining their faith or not.
Totally. So how do you think, well, let's go here first. What should we be on the lookout in terms of abuse in our churches? What do we pay attention to?
So I think it's important for everyone to get educated on what grooming behaviors look like, and not only grooming towards children, but also grooming towards adults from people that are in positions of authority over them. Now, see, like my father was a pastor, and he always liked to tell everybody he was not above anyone else. And, he was always very humble about that, which I think is good, but I think can be misunderstood. Because if you are up there preaching every Sunday, whether you want to be an authority figure or not, you are one. And so I don't mean that everybody needs to be suspicious of every person in leadership necessarily, but just be on the lookout for that, because there are certain things that you might notice that seem a little off.
Totally.
That you can call out.
So sometimes the pastor wants to be in the authority position and he acts like Mark Driscoll. Let's just say it like that. Right. Real machismo, big up front. I want the power. I have it, and I want you to know it. But I think what you're saying is abdication of power abdication of responsibility can lead to abuse too. And abdication does not mean divestment. You haven't given the power away. You're just denying you have it. And white Anabaptist men love to do this. The idea that I don't have any power because Jesus is Lord, and we're a low church, even though I'm up front, even though you're afraid of me, even though you get nervous when I call you, all these things.
Yeah. Well, and just, Anabaptists, like you said earlier, love to think we're not in the world, but we are very much in the world. We live where we live and in the times that we live in. And if, like you said, white male Anabaptists, if you're a white man in this country, you automatically have some influence, whether you want it or not. And you just have to own that. The other thing kind of going along with that is, clericalism is kind of what I'm talking about here, even though we wouldn't call it that, in these circles. But the flip side of that is, our Christian celebrity culture too. Is, we maybe learned a lot of really great things from this person, and they were really influential in how they shaped us and our faith journey. And we just don't want to believe that they could actually be doing a lot of evil that we weren't aware of. Right. And some of that is our own ego, that we want to believe that we would recognize evil when we saw it.
Totally.
But we don't. Very often we don't.
What do you think the best way for churches is to elevate voices of survivors? How do we listen to them? I think that is a key part of finding solutions to this. How do you think we can do that?
I can only speak to what has been effective for me in my case. Being given the space to be angry has been important. Being listened to is important, and not just people hearing what I'm having to say, but understanding what I'm having to say. And again, the support after the fact. It took me 20 years to get Christians supporting me after the fact for what happened with me. And it should never take somebody 2 decades to have some Christian go, you know what happened to you was wrong.
That kind of perseverance is uncommon. It's hard for people to wait 20 years to do that. Yeah. And a lot of people won't do that. And so we suppress voices, we silence them when we don't support them.
So I had an experience. It was about a year after everything had happened that I was still trying to attend church. My father got hired at a different Mennonite church up here in Michigan. And I did try to attend for a while. And I very clearly remember a Sunday school class where it was supposed to be for people who had, been through some stuff. And I was expressing myself and some of the things that some of my anger that I had. And I looked around at all the faces in there, and they were all just shocked by me. Like they couldn't, you're not at peace. You're not, praying about all of this and the judgment. I quit going to church for over a decade after that because I was there and they were letting me speak, but they weren't, I guess, maybe absorbing what I was saying at all. And they just, again, with the Anabaptists, they want to say that they're peacemakers, but they're really more peacekeepers.
Totally. And there is a big difference.
Big difference. They don't want to do the work to get to the justice, to make the peace.
Well, folks, keep listening to these pitfalls that Kristy is talking about, because it can really change how we approach our churches, our lives, our families, and so on. And none of us are immune from this. We did talk about earlier how things like purity culture and complementarianism can lend themselves to this, but don't think you're off the hook because you're egalitarian. Don't think you're off the hook because you're affirming. Abuse can still happen in those churches too. But I want to say that toxic theology creates more and more of an environment. I'm not saying they're both the same. I want to make that clear. But we can all learn something from this, as my idea here that I want to share. Kristy, you're an author of another book too. It's a book of poetry that's very funny, and as well as many other things. It's called Apologies, right? Is that right?
Yes, Apologies.
Can you tell us what inspired you to write that? Why'd you write poetry?
Gosh, that is a good question. I wish I had a really good answer for it. It's almost a companion to Act Normal in some ways. Act Normal, I was really driven by the desire to create awareness and empathy for religious trauma survivors. And Apologies, it's more, it's a little heavier into the emotions than what Act Normal was. I write mostly narrative poetry, but it's more based on truths than facts.
Totally.
And, there's things like, a purity culture word search, in there, because why not?
That was fun to do.
Yeah. So it gave me a little bit more leeway to really dig into some stuff that maybe wouldn't have fit so much in Act Normal.
Excellent. So where can we find you online? How do we keep track of what you're doing?
Okay. So I'm on Twitter. Is probably the best way to keep track of me right now is probably Twitter.
And what's your username?
Well, that's a darn good question. Let me look. I should know that.
Well, we'll get it up. You can tell us in a second, but I'll find it too. I follow you on Twitter. And where can it's Kristy Burm, B-U-R-M.
Kristy Burm,
and, where can we find your books?
Both of them are on Amazon.
And do you prefer us to buy them from Amazon?
Yes, I do. I get more money that way. So
yeah, more money. And Amazon sales also go to local bookstores and decide what they want to buy too. Yep. So that's what's up. Well, thanks so much, Kristy. What a privilege we had to talk to you. I'm excited that you shared this with us. Thanks again.
Yep. Thank you for having me on.
Of course.
We leave this last part of our episode to highlight things of it that have been nourishing our souls. We started by talking a little bit about vacations and time in other environments and how that feeds us. But we want to share some other resources that maybe could be helpful to you too. So, Jonny, you want to share what has been nourishing your soul this week?
The James Webb Space Telescope images from NASA that were just released, okay?
Yes.
This is the deepest we've ever looked into space. Unseen things. We've never seen these things. And what's amazing is what we're seeing is 13 billion years ago. Like, that's mind-boggling. How could that be? So this is what's nourishing my soul. You look at that, and it's a speck in the sky. It's like a grain of sand in the sky, this big image that we've seen of all the galaxies. That's just a tiny fraction of the sky. There is so much more. It's wild, and we're looking out through our galaxy and seeing so many more. Like, the whole cosmos is full of the glory of God. And I want to encourage us to know that when you look into what seems to be the infinite, you might get to a place where you think, oh, I'm so tiny, I'm so insignificant. And now I'm trying to worship God and connect with the creator of the universe, and I have the hubris to think I know how it all works. Maybe it'll give us some humility about where we are, but I hope it doesn't cause us to lose faith. Because there is something more out there, there's something metaphysical out there. We're seeing it around us. What a wonderful, confusing thing it is to be alive at all, right? What gives me faith isn't what I am, but that I am. So I'm thinking about the Webb Space Telescope images and in awe at them. Yeah. And then the other day at my cell meets on a roof deck.
Oh, really?
And there was this big, there was a storm threatened. But it was below us by that point. It had traveled under Philadelphia. And the sunset is just making the sky beautiful. And there's green for some reason, and yellow, and pink, and orange, and blue, obviously. And it's just majestic. We stopped to just look at our surroundings. So even as I looked at the beauty of the whole universe, basically, it sort of felt like, I'm still impressed and moved by a sunset, which I've experienced theoretically every day of my life. That the wonders of this world, the wonders that I can see with my eyes, are still magnificent. And there's essentially infinity between me and this sunrise, this sunset, as well as the whole world. Like that's like that whole experience, you know, that's what like I even looked back, that's what's holding me in my faith. I even looked back and the trees were golden. They were lit by the trees were golden and lit. And my friend Christine was like, oh, look at you noticing the outside, because I'm notorious for not doing this. And then I looked in the faces of the people around me. Mm. And they were all bright and lit beautifully. And I started taking their pictures because I liked how they looked. So, like, all of that is nourishing my soul, you know, that no matter what trouble I personally feel, I can still experience this joy and this beauty around me, and know that in my smallness I'll be taken care of, and in the vastness of the universe and the beauty that surrounds me, I'm reassured that no matter what trouble I face, we can overcome it. You know, there is so much more. Do you want to say something back about did you see these images?
That was so beautiful, Jonny. I just have to pause before we move on. I can literally almost imagine the glory of God, like, coming off of your cellmates as you're taking pictures of people. It's so beautiful. Yes, I did see the photos. They are otherworldly. And so beautiful. And actually, a friend in our congregation was over. We actually had a meeting on my back porch with cell leaders and apprentices. And Robbie has an app on his phone that he can hold up to the sky, and it will identify the constellations that you're looking at. So he was using it to, like, show me, like, look at that, see that star? And he's, like, describing things to me. And then he kept saying, now we see that bright one, but, like, just wait a little bit longer, keep staring, and you'll see another one. And I was kind of like, okay, whatever. You know, there's, like, the white light of the city kind of washing out the skies. You can't really see all that many stars. And the longer I stood looking, he was not wrong. They literally appeared to me.
Wow.
My eyes adjusted to the sky, and I could see more and more and more. And it was just wild to see it, like, unfold before me. And then Robbie's the one who was telling me about this telescope and the photos. And
it's amazing.
Yeah, it's really beautiful.
Wow. What's nourishing your soul, Julie?
So my spiritual director encouraged me. We were talking about writing, and she encouraged me to try writing morning pages, which is a new idea to me. It comes from the book, The Artist's Way, which is a very old book that I've heard about for years but never read it. And she said, oh, here, you can borrow my copy. So she pulls out her copy. It's full of underlines and notes, and she gave it to me, which to me is a treasure, because
it is a treasure.
Like getting someone's, notes as they read. But anyway, so I read about this idea of morning pages. The author encourages, the author is writing this book to help people discover and recover their creative self. And the idea of morning pages is that you start each day writing three pages of longhand writing, not typing, not like voice notes on your phone, but like actually handwriting out stream of consciousness thoughts. And they're not for anyone to see. They're not even for you to go back over and reread. But they're just, and there's no wrong way to do it. It's just the discipline of writing 3 pages by hand every morning of whatever is coming up. And she talks about how it changes you. The process of writing changes your relationship even to your own thoughts and your own self. And it helps you identify your own, like what she calls the censor. That's the voice within you, that voice of reason, or like the critic or whatever. The process of writing over time helps you to move through that. And she said morning pages will teach you that your mood doesn't really matter. You can stop judging yourself and just let yourself write, because eventually you get to the other side of whatever is coming up. And it helps you kind of get out of your logic brain and move more into a space of creativity. The artist brain that she's talking about.
That's beautiful.
Anyway, I don't know if I'm describing it very well, but it felt freeing for me. I was surprised. I've only been doing this practice for like less than 2 weeks. And I was surprised. Some of the things that have come up, some of the things that have stayed with me to keep chewing on. And it really does free me up from the whirlwind of thoughts that I can wake up with. Sometimes it's a whirlwind of anxiety. So just writing it out, it's slow. My hand hurts by the end of it.
That's great though, right?
Yeah, it is. It's a good discipline. So that has been nourishing my soul.
Good.
We hope that you are finding things that nourish your soul too. And if you care to share them with us, we'd love to hear. Write to us at Resist and Restored Podcast at circleofhope.net. Until next time.